Good evening. It's really a great pleasure to have with us today Professor Joanne Chory from the Salk Institute in La Jolla, in California, where she's also director of the Plant Molecular and Cellular Biology Laboratory. Professor Chory is, well, many things, but first and foremost, a plant geneticist and biologist with a tremendously successful and influential research career. Now that started when she was a postdoctoral fellow in the lab of Fred Osobel in Harvard Medical School in the 80s, and that was when a small plant, Arabidopsis thaliana, was then becoming the model system for studies on plant molecular genetics. And Joanne Chory has been at the front lines of plant research ever since. Throughout her research career, she has made fundamental discoveries on light signal transduction, signaling between the chloroplast and the nucleus of the cell, the circadian clock, or plant hormones, and in particular discovering and characterizing a complete signaling pathway for the plant steroid hormones, also known as brasinosteroids. Now, this might seem very diverse topics, which also illustrates the scientific and intellectual ambition of Professor Chory, but what unites all of them is the use of molecular genetics in Arabidopsis to study how plants alter their size, shape, and form in response to the environment, to optimize their growth. And the key point here is the plant's response to the environment, because that is a fundamental issue that we will have to deal with and to confront in decades because of climate alterations. Now, I said Joanne Chory's discoveries, but in truth it is Joanne Chory and her team or teams, the many PhD students and postdoctoral fellows that she has mentored and very successfully mentored throughout the years, and that now lead their own research groups all over the world, including here, because we have in our center, the Center for Research in Agricultural Genomics, CRAG in Barcelona. We have one of her former postdocs, Ana Caño. And nowadays, Professor Chory is embarking I'd say her most ambitious project. She's leading the Harnessing Plants initiative at the Salk Institute, as you will hear in a moment. And now it is for all of this, her research career and this more recent project, that she was one of the recipients this year of the Princesa of Asturias Awards in the category of scientific and technical research. And I should also add that it is the first time that such an award was given to plant biology research. So this evening you will hear first Joanne Chory, and then there will be a conversation with Michele Catanzaro, a journalist with a PhD in physics and a frequent collaborator of general and specialized media. So Professor Chory, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Seems like it's on. I guess. Can you hear me? Oh, now you can hear me. Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I've had a great week in Asturias, and you know, it was just so much fun to be there and be part of a big discussion in many different areas, climate change being one of them. And so it was a really interesting event to watch this young 13-year-old princess come on and give a very poised speech. So I'm hoping I can be 10% as good as she was. But I haven't been training my whole life, you know, like she has been, I think. But anyways, she was quite good, so here I go. Anyway, so I've been a plant geneticist for about 35 years. Let me get you the title of my talk up there. Here we go. Okay, and so about 2 years ago, sitting in my office, and we all just kind of knew. We've been challenged by a new president that the Salk Institute had hired, and she challenged us all to think bigger than the problems we were working on. And so we came up with this idea among the plant biologists who are at Salk, and we said, we know a lot about plants now. It's time for us to give back. And by giving back, I don't just mean to the science community, but to the community of humans that live on the earth, And so we decided, we wanted to get involved in the climate change crisis, because it is a crisis, and it's one we have to deal with. We want to be part of the solution. So that's what motivates us every morning when we wake up and go to work and do our experiments, okay? So the title of my talk is Fighting Climate Change with Plants. And so plants have been on the earth a lot longer than us, so they've evolved to be very good at some things, one of which is sucking CO2 like a big vacuum out of the air. And we're going to use plants to help us try to suck down some CO2 from the atmosphere. And by doing that, we hope to have an impact on the amount of CO2 that's acting as a greenhouse gas up there, and that would have an effect, again, on either slowing down all this global warming, which is causing dramatic climate extremes, and so we'll see how we do, okay? So we want to be part of that solution. It's a big problem, so what I wrote here, it takes a global village to solve a global problem. So we're not claiming we can solve this problem. We just want to be part of the solution. And that's all motivated by the person who founded the Salk Institute, Jonas Salk, who basically pretty close to eradicated the planet from polio. For people who are older than me, they all know someone with polio. And so there's two quotes I want to have here from Jonas Salk that inspired me. And so this quote on the upper right-hand corner is, "Hope lies in dreams and imagination and in the courage of those who dare to make those dreams a reality." And that's a great quote for scientists. It's very motivating. You want to have a dream, you want to solve a problem. Okay, but it's the one on the lower left-hand corner, which also really influences the way you feel about climate change, right? And this is our greatest responsibility, is to be good ancestors. What kind of planet are we going to be leaving our children and grandchildren, right? Do we want to have life continue to be somewhat the way it is right now? We have to ask ourselves those questions, and then we have to get involved in a solution if we want an answer that is more than let's just have a slightly worse Earth, or even much more worse Earth than we have right now. And I don't want to leave that to my children. I have 2 children, 24 and 21, and I want them to inherit a planet in better shape than the one I got from my parents and grandparents. Okay. So here's the theme of my talk. Our world is in bad shape, but there is something we can do about it. And as a plant geneticist, I thought about plants. And so if you're some other kind of engineer, whatever, you might think of a different solution. So here's the state of the world we have to deal with right now. And so all the problems are mostly being caused by the number of people who are living on the planet. Right now we have 7.8 billion people. We're going to have, it's predicted we'll have 11 billion by the end of the century, okay? And so this is causing a competition. There's not enough land to feed all of those people, house all those people, and at the same time stay sustainable, right? And so I'll just show you a bunch of other problems that come up from Mother Nature's side, all right? We won't spend a lot on them, but these people are causing an increased demand for food and feed and fiber, et cetera. We have stressed crops, so we're losing yield on crops. We also have collapsed ecosystems all over the planet, both agricultural ecosystems and the more natural ones. And we have increased CO2 emissions. That's coming from the human side. And lastly, I think I said, we have all these effects from global warming. So our action or inaction, both of those are actually actions, okay? In the next 10 years, will determine our fate. And I really believe that's true, and the IPCC has said we have 10 years or so to solve this problem, right? We won't have an Earth like the one we live on right now. All right, so who's the culprit in all of this? In general, CO2, or carbon dioxide, is considered sort of the bad guy. It's the bad guy, but to most people who read the newspaper, right? Because CO2 is a greenhouse gas. But I'm going to tell you, as a plant biologist, I see the good side of CO2. It's much more than a greenhouse gas. CO2 is a source of food for plants. And all that CO2 from the air gets sucked up by plants and converted by the process of photosynthesis into sugars and other products. So all of us are composed of carbon. All living things on Earth are composed of carbon. And all that carbon comes from the air. So that big tree you see outside your window or whatever, all that mass came from CO2 in the air. I mean, that's really pretty remarkable, right? And so we wanted to take advantage of that fact. And so, well, I don't think I'm telling you that yet. Okay, so first I want to tell you what the bad side of all the CO2 greenhouse gases are in the air. So every year we have an annual cycle where carbon from the atmosphere interacts with both the land and the sea. And every year, you see here, these numbers don't really mean much, but it's about 750 gigatons or 750 billion tons of CO2 that's captured by nature. And by nature, I mean it's captured by photosynthetic microorganisms and plants as a part of the whole photosynthetic process. But every year, okay, let me tell you. And so we have that problem, and then, so that is not a problem, I'm sorry. And so then we have this problem, though, that most of these plants only do this on a seasonal level. And so at the end of every growing season, we end up with 727 of those hard-fought gigatons that we captured being released right back up into the atmosphere. So we have to deal with that number now. And then we have to deal with what humans have added, and that's another 37 gigatons, okay? And so this is where the carbon cycle goes off balance, and we have to think about it. All right, so here's the numbers, and they come up fast. But what happens is, of those 37 gigatons that humans are putting up there by burning fossil fuels, et cetera, the planet can mostly, or nature can mostly deal with about 20 of those, so we only end up having to cover for 18. And then, so that's not it's a huge number, but it's not as huge as the numbers the planet is pushing around. So the good news is that the planet looks like it has the capacity to do this, right? We're asking the planet to help us out a little here. We'll put up 18 gigatons too much. And so what we need is for you to get a little better at capturing carbon in stable forms that can be buried in the earth. All right. So how would we ask plants to do this for us? We think there's only 3 traits we need to have the plant change somewhat, right? So we have plants, we have crop plants in particular, and crop plants have been selected for a lot of growth above the ground and not much growth below the ground. And so what we want are, we need to make the plants make more root for us, because we want the plant to redistribute what it usually puts into sugars and ends up back in the atmosphere, but instead keep it in the root. And the way we want to do this is by using a polymer that plants make anyway. It's called suberin. I think I don't have it on the slide, I'm sorry. And so this is a polymer that doesn't get decomposed. I snuck my ear thing off, sorry. Give me a second. Sorry. Thank you. So we want the plant to redistribute some of those sugars that normally get decomposed because microbes come and eat up the plant, and put it into this polymer. And this polymer is made in the roots of all flowering plants. So it's a good one to pick, right? Because it's something the plant makes anyway. It just needs to make a little more of it. And we want it to make more of it. Okay. We want it to make more of it by making more roots. So we have an indirect way of increasing the amount of that polymer. And then we want those roots to grow deep into the ground. And the reason why we want that to happen is because there's less oxygen down there, and then there are not many microbes that will decompose the plant and send all that CO2 right back up. All right, so here's suberin, and I think it's obvious if you look at this slide why we chose it. So everywhere you see a little black dot, that's a carbon, okay? And so if you look at this compound, this polymer, you can see there's hundreds of black dots. And in the middle part, there's no red dots, and those red dots are actually oxygen. And why is it important to know where oxygens are? Is that that's the entry point for microbes to come in and chop that baby up, and then you decompose it, and then everything goes up into the atmosphere. So suberin is a molecule that we believe will be more stable and won't break down as quickly in soils as other compounds that plants make. And so if we get plants to make a little more suberin, that'll be great. And so then we can make more roots, and that'll make it even have more suberin. So I think we can do the science. Just let me tell you that. And here's the idea, okay? So this cartoon is showing you on the left a normal plant, and on the right what we're calling ideal plants. And so our ideal plants are going to suck up CO2, and you can see the CO2 at the top, bring it down, and instead of just re-releasing it back out like the wild-type plant over there on the left-hand side, it's going to bury it for us deep in the earth. And that means less CO2 will come out. So that's basically our whole idea. Is if we can change these three traits, we should be able to stack these traits and plant these seeds, and then we'll have plants that sequester more carbon stably in the soil, releasing less back up to the atmosphere. And it's only 2% more efficient than plants already are at doing this right now. All right, so I think we can do the science, and we've done a lot of it in model plants. All right. So here is an example of a model plant called a Arabidopsis, and the plant on the right is making more roots, right? And so in the way it's making more roots, I won't get into it with you tonight, but it involves a plant hormone that had been suspected that could be involved in this process. And we actually tested our hypothesis, and it looks like that's going to work, okay? So we have a single gene that we misexpress in the leaves of these plants, and they make all that much more root, and that's more than twice as much just in that one simple experiment. All right. Here's another way we made more roots. And I just wanted to show you this because we think we need to make more roots in many different ways. Because once we understand what genes are involved, we need to go and do the same experiment in a crop plant. Because we want to use crop plants because they grow all over the earth, and also because they use up most of the land that's arable for growing plants in a good, healthy state. So we have 6 crops we're working on, 3 grains, and soybean, cotton, and canola. And these take up, more than 80% of all the arable land, those 6 crops. So if we can move these traits into those 6 crops, that'll be great. But we think not everyone's going to move in by the same mechanism, right? So we want to have like 10 different ways that plants might make bigger roots. So that's what we're trying to do right now, and we have so far 4 different ways that plants end up with bigger roots. And if you have any plants with big roots and you want to donate them to our cause, we'll take them from you and try to work with them in our program. All right. Okay. And here's how we got deeper roots. And again, deeper roots is another trait that, is going to be more or less easy, I think. And so here is a cut through a pot now. And what we're looking at the top of those little red lines, and those little red lines represent roots because they're roots being stained by a dye that does that. And you can see that those roots are actually, even though they're going in and out of the focal plane, they basically are meandering around at the top of the pot, right? And so we wanted to see if we can find deeper roots. And Wolfgang Busch's lab just published a paper about this. And they found them. And this was a natural allele, a natural variant of one single gene in Arabidopsis out of 30,000 that caused that root architecture to change from meandering around the top to grow down deep and bury the superimposers, hopefully. Okay, so that just shows you how we're getting at the 3 traits that we think we need to change. All right. So will this cause a global change in the amount of CO2 that's up in the atmosphere? And we think the answer to that, and this is all done on the back of an envelope, and we won't really know if it's going to work until we actually have the plants and make measurements. But we think we can see a change, there we go, of 4 to 8. We can draw down every year, once we get fully at scale, 4 to 8 gigatons of CO2. That's a massive amount of CO2 to draw down. We think plants can do it, and it's actually, it's at the scale of global change, and that's what we need. And I think this is the only kind of technology that can be affordable enough to get negative net emissions. And we were talking about Michele and I before we came on stage. Okay, so 8 gigatons is like half of all that stuff that's in excess right now. That would be great. All right, I'm almost done. So how long is this going to take us? We think it'll probably take 10 years before we're full scale. So in the meantime, you should support foundations that are planting trees and trying to draw down CO2 by changes in land use. And I think that's a really good cause. If you want to be involved at all in climate change, that would be one way to get involved now. Our cause is like, our solution is the kind of phase 2 solution, right? Where you come in right when we get into that critical point with all these plants, and we'll have all the seed if this all works out the way we're hoping. And then farmers will plant it, and the infrastructure doesn't have to change, right? And so this makes our technology extremely cheap. We calculated we can do this for about $10 a gigaton. No, $10 a ton, I'm sorry. Okay, of CO2, $10 a gigaton, that'd be a buy. Okay, anyway. But anyway, and so this is because you need no new infrastructure, right? Like direct air capture is a highly touted method in the press for removing excess CO2 from the atmosphere. But right now, the calculations are about $1,000 a ton. That's 100 times more. And it's also in a range that no country can afford to get involved. Okay, so, all right. So I think we're at the end of my talk. So why I believe this initiative will work. And I think I have a lot of the right words that this kind of initiative is looking for. So first of all, it's a global initiative addressing a global problem. Plants grow all over the earth, and they grow in many different climates. So we'll just put the crop plants back into their natural environments and see, if they draw down more CO2, okay? It's also scalable. That's important because we might not have full, 8 gigaton drawdown till 10 years, but every time we add a new trait, and we'll draw down a little more if our hypotheses are correct, right? And so to be scalable is really important because what that helps you to do is scale up, and it also will let you scale down if that becomes necessary, right? Okay, it's iterative, and by that I mean you can do this in any plant. We're pretty sure, plants are enough alike that we should be able to do this kind of technology in any plant, not just crop plants. All right, so it's distributive. By that I'm trying to address this whole idea of the infrastructure that's in place with governments and their farmers, in all the reward systems that might be available to them. We want to make available to them for these kinds of crops too, ones that are there for CO2 sequestration. No new infrastructure, I already talked about that. And lastly, plants have a track record at a planetary scale. So they made the Earth inhabitable for human life by releasing oxygen when they split water in the photosynthesis reaction. And so, we're just asking them, please help us out one more time, right? And so hopefully, this planetary scale, their track record means a lot to a panel who's going to be evaluating. Their track record means a lot more than mine, I think. And so hopefully they'll help us do this. All right, so here's the team. There's 5 of us. It's a small group, and we kind of brainstormed this all together. Each of us has our own lab, and some of us are now closing down the other part of our labs and really focusing on the climate change problem. And then here's the bigger group that's working on it, and we're on the right, and there's people on the left. But you can see the funding sources. And I like to point this out because this project has actually almost entirely, been funded by philanthropy. All right, so these are people who have a long-term vision and the patience to wait for something to happen. That's a really hard thing to do. And so Salk Institute is one of those places. They got us started. Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the HHMI there, I'm one of their investigators, so they help us by getting equipment and pay for some salaries. And Howard Newman is a member of our board of trustees who funded the early stages of this project. And then we have the Audacious project at TED. And this is TED of TED Talk fame, right? And so they have this contest. We were in the second year of this contest. They had 1,500 applicants, and we made the finals, and they found us 10 new donors that supported this project at our full ask, which was $35 million. And so now we have the money, and we now have the pressure on us to go with that, to basically say this project is going to work or it's not going to work, right? And I think we just need to know the answer. And so if it's not going to work, then we move on, as fast as possible. And if it's going to work, then work harder to get it to happen even faster. And I think that is my talk. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot for this great talk, and especially for this very illuminating idea. When I heard about it for the first time, it really looked that everything matched in this idea. Before starting the conversation, let me very briefly remind you the urgency of the subject we are dealing with. So a couple of months ago, the United Nations have released this United in Science report, which says things like the fact that we are already 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels, which means, among other things, that the last 5 years have been the hottest years ever on record. In the same time, emissions have increased exponentially. 2018 was the record year in emissions, and the impacts that we are seeing are coming sooner and harder than we expected. And there is one graph in this report that really shocked me. It's basically a graph that tells you when should emissions peak in order to achieve this 1.5 increase in temperature that is considered to be the best scenario between 1.5 and 2, and this emission should peak next year, 2020, okay? So it's really 15 months to change a trend that has been increasing massively in the last few years. So I'm telling all this because there is one thing in this graph that connects directly to what we are talking about, that is that even with this very abrupt and, unfortunately, I must say, improbable change in the trend, we still need to have what is called negative emissions. That is, in order to match that 1.52 target, we still need to have a device, a tool, a system to suck CO2 away from the atmosphere. It's not enough to change the trend in emission. We still need to have some sort of capture system, okay? And here is where a system like this one plays a key role. So there is a version, let's say, of this system that is already in place, as you mentioned, which is called offsetting. It's basically taking normal plants and planting them. So I take a flight and I can pay for somebody to plant seeds, to plant trees, or for example, now there is even a web browser in which the energy that is lost in browsing, in searching, not browser, search engine, the energy that is used in searching can be translated into trees. However, there are concerns even with this very basic version of the system, like, for example, competition with food land, with fuel land, the increased fires. Even I've heard that in some places planting more trees, planting more plants can even result in increased temperature. So I wanted to hear, what is your opinion about offsetting? Is it, let's say, just planting trees, planting plants, is it a solution, and whether these problems may affect also your system?
Yeah, okay, so trees, good or bad, right? I think trees are good for now, but to keep trees sequestering CO2 means you have to keep chopping them down and taking out all the root that's there and putting it somewhere and then starting over again. So every time you end up with a big cycle. And I think early on we didn't really know the best soils where trees would be productive at sequestering CO2, okay? And so I think now scientists know a lot better. They have a lot more empirical measurements, and that's going to help them decide where the best tree plantings will be, where trees being planted will be most productive. And so, yeah, I do, I buy trees for my family members. You can buy them for $1 a tree, but buy them from the right place, because only some places really know the best spots to plant them. Okay, and I think that will make a difference. And the other difference that can happen right now is land use, how we water our plants, if we till or not as farmers, how much fertilizer we use, because that actually is not so great. Herbicides deplete, all the biodiversity in the soil. So we need to rebuild our soils, and I think that will be one way also. At the same time, you can sequester more carbon in trees. You need to rebuild your soils, and that's something that our technology is we hope, will be good at, though no one really has the measurement yet. But what we hope is that we can make the soils on Earth more sustainable, and that's what you really need to do, because the agriculture of the last 70 years or so was geared toward feeding a whole bunch of people, right? And so that's so that is an issue we have to deal with now, that we can feed 8 billion people. That's why we have 8 billion people on the planet. But what it has done is made all of our soils unsustainable. And so by putting more carbon back into soils, that's going to have a long-term impact, because it's actually going to probably increase yields. Mm-hmm. And so that's all good, right? And so I think it's just going to be, there's going to be combinations. I think land use is ahead right now, you know, how farmers farm and how much more sustainable their practices might become in order to get at some of this.
So I understand that, let's say, trees, offsetting with trees is good by now, but your technology has certain advantages. I mean, one that is certainly very interesting that you are mentioning is that you don't only sequester carbon, but that carbon inside the land, it makes the land better. So
That's
you're
right.
solving two problems at a time somehow.
That's right. And you
Okay.
have to deal with feeding people at the same time you're
Okay.
trying to deal with
three
all the
problems.
other problems, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so three for, I think. But anyways,
So-
yeah, but I mean, it is an issue, right? We have to do this humanely. We're gonna let a lot of people starve just to get the CO2 down by a little.
Okay.
You know, I don't know, we can't.
Yeah.
I don't think we have it in us, you know, to
Yeah,
do that, something so.
There is this really, for me, absurd discussion about decarbonizing poverty. So keeping poverty there and then taking away the carbon, while your system seems to be very careful with the issue of food as well. The background of the idea behind your system is using plants to take carbon and put it underground. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm simplifying it, but this is shared with other technologies, like I'm thinking of biochar, so this carbon in which CO2 is sequestered, and the idea is just buried physically underground. I've read about pyrolysis, so a system that takes biomass and burns it, basically, transform it into charcoal, oil, and gases that can be put underground. So how does your system compare with this one? How better it is
Well,
as
I think
compared
it's
to
hard
other
for all
systems?
of us to know exactly how good our systems are without the data, right?
Okay.
So biochar, I think that one, most people would rank it as pretty popular. But biochar is not trivial to make. You have to make very small particles. And the particles of this char need to be a certain size, okay? And so it performs best at a certain size depending on the soil. So you have to train people to do it. And then you have to also bring all that char to the fields, right? And so that's going to also cost energy as well. But I think, you know, biochar might be another answer. And the biochar enthusiasts are working hard at it the way we are. And I think this burning idea, I'm not a big fan of it. But, you know, I think there are some people who like it. But burning, again, you know, there's a lot more energy that goes in that hasn't been calculated into the price of how much carbon dioxide you can sequester for a certain amount of money, right?
Yeah.
And so,
So
I
maybe
think
this
that's the problem right now, is that people think the price is too high and most of the technologies are not scalable and in a global way. And if that's the case, we can never solve the problem, right?
Okay. And so I understand this connect with what you were saying, that this proposal kind of seamless integrates with how things already work. So it's only a matter of changing the seed that you use from one that with small roots to one with big roots.
That's not a trivial matter.
No,
I mean, I don't want to make it sound like we can just go out and do that.
Yeah.
We have to get farmers to buy in.
Yeah.
And because there's so much land that we have to change what we were growing on it, we need to get at least one of the big food companies in on the seed companies, you know, like, you know, Bayer or, you know, these guys own the market, right?
Oh, of course.
And so, but I think if farmers want it, they'll follow. They'll give farmers what they want. That's what we're hoping. But, you know, we have to just wait and see.
Okay.
So this is stuff we're working on now, even before we know whether or not our technology is going to work, because we realized we really have to get these policies in place on the government, you know, the agriculture bills that they're putting in place now for 2023, right?
Yeah.
And so it's far down the road, but it's not that far when you're talking the lifetime, the generation time of plants.
Yeah.
And so, so we have to do all the stuff, and everybody has to get involved in that.
Okay.
Yeah.
You give us a time frame of 10 years for starting to see results. So I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on this, on how close, let's say, is your vision. And for example, I was wondering, you're working now, I understand, with Arabidopsis and Lotus japonica, I think. What is the first actual crop that you plan to target?
Well,
if there is one,
Yeah, okay. This is not one of our specialty crops, but it's so easy to put genes into tobacco.
Yeah.
That's what we've done. We already have created transgenic tobacco that we can look at and see whether or not we had an impact on the size of the roots, et cetera. We haven't made those measurements yet, but we'll know that very soon. But the first crop of our list of crops, we're going to do as many as we can in parallel. And so some of these will be done at facilities that are expert at a particular crop. Like soybean, University of Missouri is expert, or whatever, something like that, right? And some of them we'll be able to do ourselves. So I think we'll be able to do canola at home, we think. And so, we can do some, and we'll have other people do some. And then we'll have to gather up all these plants. We're already preparing we're lining up field sites, because all this really needs to be done. All these measurements need to be done in the soils that these plants will be growing on, right? And so that's all it's starting to happen right now, too. So it's a massively parallel project, even though it's just 3 traits. So it's not trivial, right?
And do you see that the community is sort of getting excited, that people is looking at it, and maybe experts in different crops will jump on it as soon as you show it?
Well, okay, I think as soon as we show proof of principle, real proof of principle, the experts will jump on it. But right now, we've kind of caught the imagination of the public, right? And so I gave this TED Talk. It has a lot of hits. And so people who view it write to me about ideas they have, right? So, I think the potato is the most common idea people have, because there was this Matt Damon movie, I don't know if you ever saw it, where he gets to live on Mars or whatever for a year or two because he calculated the free energy state of eating a potato and cooking it. I don't know, he was a physicist like you are. And so anyways, he figured it out, and he lived there a long time. So you should do potato. I get a lot of letters that say that. And a lot of people don't want to help.
Okay.
But scientists need to do the science, at least at first, right? Because you need to have really good measurements you can compare from site to site. So we're not letting all of our fans just do the science for us. We have to do that ourselves.
Okay, then I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you plan to do it. That is, are you going to use standard breeding, or CRISPR, for example, or transgenics? What is the techniques you are considering, or technique you are considering?
We're considering all those techniques. I'm afraid to say anything in Europe, though, because Europe really does not like the transgenics much, right? And so we have natural isolates, we can find in nature, and we want to be sensitive to the communities involved, too. So in wheat, the growers do not want to have GMO wheat, so there's no GMO wheat sold, even in the United States. It has embraced the technology. And so we're sensitive to that. So we have these drought-resistant wheats that came from the desert around Iran. And so these plants have really big roots. So maybe we won't get every one of those traits into those plants, but just breeding that out and making the crosses to the wheat that makes the bread that Americans like to eat, right? There's 4 varieties of bread. I think that will be partly an answer, right? We have wheat that's making way more roots. They should be making more suberin. And so we're trying to work, so this is somebody who listened to my TED Talk, but he was a scientist at one of the Big 10 schools in our Midwest where there's a lot of agriculture. And so he offered us, to get involved with his plants.
Wow,
and so he shaved a few years off our project with wheat, because wheat is a very difficult plant to work with. It has a lot of copies of its chromosomes. And so it means you have to wait way longer to see a trait segregate out by breeding. So that's one example, we can do that. Natural variants, are actually pretty powerful, and that's what standard breeding is based upon, you know, where you find the gene for the big tomato out in the wild somewhere, and then you cross it in. And so you could do it that way, too. And that's not objectionable to Europe or India or the other countries that have a problem with GMO. Okay. And so, you know, in the United States, I'll be honest with you, you know, over 90% of our corn and soybean is already GMO. So we're going to just put transgenes in there.
Okay.
All right, so I won't lie to you because the science comes out a lot faster.
Yeah.
And so we can at least assess those plants. And even though we might not grow them all over the earth or even grow them at all, we'll get the answers to those without too much hassle. Because we won't have a big, you know, we'll have a few small fields where we're growing. Yeah, so.
Yeah, when we were having a conversation before, I mentioned, okay, so the scenario is you have the main crops that capture CO2, and moreover, so you don't use land for CO2 capture, but you use it for food production, and moreover, they enrich soil with carbon. I mean, all this sounds really too good to be true, so I was wondering, I asked you, is there any side effect? And you mentioned a very interesting one, that it may be overshooting. Could you share it with the...
We have this idea that we'd be so good at CO2 sequestration that we'd put the plant in a mini ice age or whatever, planet in a mini ice age.
So you cool the planet too much.
Yeah, right. I mean, I don't think we're going to do that, but it is a side effect that you should deal with, seriously, right? And I think this is where the scalability of our project works, because say we're planting 10 million acres of corn, and then we say, well, we're going to overshoot. You can see it coming. You just kill off some of those plants, you know, or don't plant them next year. And so there's ways to do this with plants. I think that you know, you can probably fine-tune it and get the temperature just where you want it. But you know, all right, I won't go into something else. I was going to go into something else, but we don't need to get there tonight. Okay.
Okay.
So.
I wanted to ask you something about your life as a scientist, and in particular, you have shown us this very nice image of Salk Institute. Could you tell me, I mean, you have been working there for a lot of time. What is the role of Salk Institute in your story as a scientist, and what is special, let's say, about this very special institution?
Yeah. For me, the Salk Institute is great because, first of all, it's small, right? And so I know every other scientist at the Institute, more or less. And so it's open to having open conversations about science. And to have open conversations about science, you need to trust the people you're talking to, you know? And people won't tell you their most wacky ideas unless they really know that you respect them no matter if they're wacky or not, right? And so you have to have that kind of open environment. And that was something that Jonas Salk really wanted to have there. And the city of San Diego embraced them, you know, and on this beautiful site. And then Louis Kahn came and positioned these buildings so that right at the fall and spring equinox, you're looking at the moon setting or the sun coming up, you know, right along this body of water, which is a fountain. We call it the River of Life because it looks like it flows out right to the ocean. So you have this beautiful ocean view there and everything. It's a very inspiring sight, you know, just like this one. So maybe not just like this one, but I mean, it's inspiring. And you can't underestimate just how much a site does for your creativity. I think it has made a difference with me to be at that site. And so I think Salk has been really good in that sense, you know, and Salk has had its issues, but overall, you know, we're kind of like a family of scientists. You know, I think it's been a good place for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, regarding issues, there have been recently issues regarding gender at Salk. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, but maybe in general, I would like to ask you about how have you seen the evolution of women in science in your years of career?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I already said this once today. I'll say it again. I think the biases against me as a plant scientist have been worse than the biases against me as a female who does science, right? And that's because I think in Europe and in the United States and most places, biomedical science dominates what life sciences has become, right? And so those guys have all forgotten what photosynthesis is, or that plants are our silent friends, or whatever, right? And so I think in the bias in that field is the only important questions are ones that solve diseases, But there are other issues, and nature being one of them, being one with nature as we live on this planet, is something we need to really kind of get a better grasp of. And so plant sciences has lagged behind biomedical sciences because there's no money in it. And so that, I think, so I've been at Salk, I was lucky in that sense, because they were willing to hire me, even though we were a real biomedical institute by far. And also, they nominated me to be a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator, and that gave me kind of the opportunity to open up the world of plants to another whole group of biomedically oriented scientists. And so I think, all that has been important. And that's not addressing the women issue. But, as a plant scientist, I was unable to function under the radar at a place like Salk, right? Mm-hmm. And so, it's not really an ideal situation. You want to be up front where all the other big guys are functioning, right? But we do well. Our program does really well, so we've won the respect of our local colleagues. The women at Salk have struggled more in that sense, I think. As a group, we're not so united on our front necessarily. That's hurt us, and things like that. And we've had a male-dominated culture. But I think most universities, I hate to say this, have had male-dominated cultures. And so Salk's not a perfect place, but, we paid the cost of it by losing some of our female scientists and getting all this bad press. Yeah, it was horrible. It's been
But
horrible.
in general, if you're looking at the broad balance of the situation, there is this graph that shows how, let's say, the presence of women in science goes down in time, in function of the age of the scientist. Do you think this has improved? Have you seen an improve? Because apparently it's not improving as fast as expected.
No, so in biology is a good example of that too. So in biology, there's more than 50% of undergraduates in biology are women, so more than 50%, right? By the time you get to your PhD, that number's gone down a fair amount in terms of the ratio of of females to males. And then by the time you get a faculty job, it's gone down even more. And then going from assistant professor to a tenured full professor is even harder. So those curves don't look good. They don't look good. Yeah. On the other hand, if other kinds of diversity which would be brought into science is not even happening at a level where you can look at numbers. So with women, I think we have the first opportunity to correct it. So hopefully, as a community, we do that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
You have been living with Parkinson's disease for many years now, and in the same years you have collected one scientific success after another, which is really inspiring. So I was wondering whether you had some thought for people with this condition and for the whole society based on your experience.
Well, I think, we all are humbled by the diseases that get us. And so Parkinson's is the one that I have. It certainly has taught me some obvious lessons firsthand, right? And so that is, live each day for what it is and make the most of it. So that's what I try to do with my disease. And, if I didn't have this project now, I don't know where I would be. I know I don't look like I'm in great shape right now, but I think I'd be a lot worse, frankly. And so we'll see. I don't want to see that. So, I like it that I keep busy, it keeps my mind active, because Parkinson's is known to cause dementia in some of its patients. And so, I don't want to go there. And so I'm just trying to stay as busy as possible. And why not be busy with something that's going to make a difference to my kids, right? And so
Of course.
that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay.
Oh, great. So I would open to the floor. Now you have 20 minutes or something. Yeah, around 20 minutes to pose questions. So take advantage of this quite unique occasion. Any question? One here?
First of all, thank you for coming. We know the effort that you make coming here. And what I want to ask is that this type of super plants are more linked to the parks or to the new buildings that they are thinking to build with gardens, with vertical gardens, in which place would be more efficiency? Thank you very much.
Where would they be, let me see if I get this right. Where would they be more effectively used, basically? In a glass house or in a field? Is that?
In the garden, in the vertical gardens of buildings,
Okay.
or in the park of inside the city?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is the use of these things inside the city in connection
Yeah.
with building, whether...
I think we would probably want them grown wherever the people have the space to grow them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of vertical gardens are happening in places even like California that it has sprawly cities. You don't have to be putting them into a vertical greenhouse like that, but like leafy greens and tomatoes and things, they grow much better in those. And they use less resources, so if we need to use less resources, I would vote for that being grown under LED lights in the right vertical greenhouse environment. And if it was, if you had the field space, I mean, some plants are so big, like maize is a huge plant, It stands way taller than me, et cetera. And so you need to be outside, I think. You can't really do those in the vertical greenhouse. But yeah, so I would say both have their place.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, very nice talk. I have a question here.
Okay.
So we know that plants are very important for sequestering CO2, but we shouldn't forget about all the other organisms like microalgae that do the same in the oceans, and they also are very important for carbon fixation.
Right.
Have you thought about any strategies that we could do in such microorganisms?
We're not working on the microorganisms, but other people are, and I encourage them to do it for sure. And there's only so much you can do, right? And so we haven't really laid out a very deep. You can get the basic idea pretty quickly on this kind of a project, but then to lay out the basic idea of how you bring it to scale, that's where the project takes a lot of time, right? And so with the microalgae, I know there are people working on it. And so I don't know, I haven't heard the latest about how they want to bring it to scale. Yeah, but I think, a lot of people think you can bury a lot of things in the ocean too, if you get it down deep enough. So that would be the way to do it. And certainly, higher, plants are a big part of the photosynthetic microbiome, but they came a lot later than all the other photosynthetic organisms. And microorganisms do a lot of fixation of CO2 for sure. We just decided to work on this idea from the food angle. And so that's why we're coming at it this way. Okay.
One question there.
Thank you very much for the talk. A wonderful topic, and it's very thought-provoking to think about fighting climate change with plants. My question is about food-related. So what do you think would be the difference between the food of wild-type plant and the modified plant? Would it be different or of the same quality? And the second part is the water consumption. Does it have like a different...
I get these questions a lot. Okay. Yeah, those are
Thank
very good questions, and you obviously understand what agriculture is doing. But anyways, yeah, and so there are a few reports out there that say when plants fix more CO2, they grow faster, they have more biomass, but they're less nutritious. You know, and by nutrition is being measured by what are the trace elements that those plants are retaining that we eat, right? And so, all right, so I think that more work needs to be done on that. In terms of water use efficiency, if we can get the suberin levels up without killing plants, which I didn't go into that in my talk today, sometimes we kill plants when we do that. But anyways, but in general, if you make a soil with more carbon in it, that soil retains water a lot better. And so if our suberized roots are adding to the abilities of that soil to sustain more organic carbon, we actually think the water use efficiency will be even better, you know, so it'll be more efficient. It could be, maybe not. We have to get the data, but we will get that data sometime soon, I think. Okay.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So related to the previous question, I just was thinking that maybe you could use this strategy also in aquatic plants or oceanic plants. Like here in the Mediterranean Sea, we have Posidonia, which is very good at keeping a good health for the ecosystem. So do you think that Posidonia would be too different from terrestrial plants to use this strategy, or could it be done?
It could be done, and in fact, we have I didn't go into the details in my talk tonight, but we have a three-pronged program, and we're using wetlands plants, right, or these coastal plants. Plants that are involved in keeping, they actually sequester a lot of carbon. They filter the water and keep a lot of carbon where it should be, and they build land. They're very important. And we've lost all sorts of those plants in the last 30 years or so. And so seagrasses are down by 80% of what they used to be. And this is a good place to sequester carbon. You know, mangrove is being chopped up by poor countries who rather sell bananas and get some money for them, right? They don't really care that mangroves can sequester a lot of carbon and build land. That's too bad. And then also like cattail, that's another one. It's both brackish water, fresh water, and salt water. And cattail is a major way to build land and keep the coastlines safe. And they also are involved in sequestering carbon. So that is an initiative we're working on because we think aquatic plants will, they will inform us about the land plants, but also the land plant work will inform about the aquatic plants as well. And so it was a good synergy for us to just keep it all to the plant world as opposed to bringing in microbes. So that's how we're doing that. And that's where, you know, that's Joe Noel's half of the story. And so I didn't tell it to you tonight. We don't have it fully funded anyway. So.
More questions? Otherwise, I have one myself. So, science in this sort of initiatives is half of the problem, but then comes business, regulation, which is half or even more than half of the problem. So what, I mean, you mentioned that you are already working on some of the regulatory issues. What is the plan? I mean, how will this be made interesting to big companies, affordable to farmers, with a regulation that really puts incentives to this project to be carried about? Do you have a strategy?
We have a lot. We have some different ones right now. Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, overall, we've hired, you know, we had a volunteer, actually, mm-hmm. who's a trial lawyer, so he's used to talking to people, mm-hmm. you know, and getting the information from them that he needs to get, right? And so that's an important trait that none of the scientists had. Mm-hmm. And so he's an important part of our team. Mm-hmm. And so he goes out there and makes connections to all the types of people we need to be talking to, mm-hmm. either as a consultant or somehow as an advisor to our program. Mm-hmm. And so that's one way we're getting at it. But, the strategy of, a lot, there's one way, you can say you're going to sell, farmers will get CO2 credits for growing plants to sequester some CO2. I mean, a lot of governments are talking about it, but so far there is not a real plan for that. But we're trying to stay involved with that, and we're actually writing some stuff for the Farm Bill to help them include plants in the answer. Because if you don't have the answers, in place, like how you might want to do it, then you lose another you can lose 5 years easily when it involves governments, right?
Yeah.
Because they're talking about budgets for the Department of Energy and U.S., the Department of Agriculture, et cetera, for 2024 now. And so if we go to sleep on that part of our project is doomed for failure, right?
Yeah.
We can't go to sleep on that, so we have to stay with it.
Yeah.
So we probably need more than one person doing it. But yeah, I think, that's at least that's a start for us.
And what about companies? Do you think such a product may be appealing for them for some reason, and why?
I think if we can interest farmers, so we're already talking to farmers, as we have a lot of farming around the San Diego area. So we're starting to talk to farmers in Imperial Valley, for instance. They have a lot of land. And so they tell us what their needs are. And we think if the farmers want our seeds, or seeds like ours, the ones we enable the world to do it or whatever, then I think, the seed companies will sell it.
Yeah, there will be demand for it. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. One question there.
Hi, here. So I have a question about how you're translating your research from Arabidopsis into crops. So you're first using Arabidopsis to explore the traits that you want to include in your crop plants. How easy are you finding the translation of the science from Arabidopsis into crops?
Sorry. Since we have both mentioned Arabidopsis, for those that are not expert, is a sort of model organism. Okay, so it's a plant that is used in the lab. It also exists in nature, but it's used, let's say, as the toy, let me say, with which plant scientists play to make experiments, etc. So this is just for those that are not expert.
So you want to know how easy is it to take a trait from Arabidopsis and show it has the same effect in another plant? Like, can I make a big-rooted corn plant if I know how to make one in Arabidopsis? Is that basically the question, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think the answer is sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so it's an unfortunate answer because I think we have to just do experiments in order to see what the answer is. And so, yeah. I think, like I can make an Arabidopsis plant, which is not that big, into a tiny little dwarf, right? This is other research my lab did many years ago. But we took those same genes and stuck them in tobacco, and tobacco went from a 6 foot tall, 2 meter tall plant down to something about that big. And all the cells were tiny little cells. And so that was a trait that was easy to transfer out of Arabidopsis into dicots, which are the broadleaf plants. But also, that particular trait worked well even in monocots, like the grasses, like corn and wheat and rice, right? So some traits work all across the board. Some traits work only to nearby plants. Sometimes Arabidopsis isn't very good at making a prediction for anybody, and so we have to just kind of go with the flow. So that's me. Okay.
One question there and one there.
Where am I looking?
Here.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for your talk. And my question is, what the plants do with this polymer, with this suberin they keep?
What are they going to do with the suberin they keep?
Yes.
I think the idea, I have some data, but I didn't show it to you tonight, but the idea is that the roots will break up into little pieces over time if the farmers don't till them. And so those little pieces will have some of that polymer, suberin, that we're making more of now, and they mix in with the soil. And the idea is some soils will actually keep them around for thousands of years. It looks like peat, it's that kind of a soil. And so some soils don't keep them around as long. And it depends if those root tissues get far enough into the deep into the soil. Because if they go deep, it's actually good because there's not much oxygen down there. And then the suberin won't break down. So what we'll be doing is adding organic carbon to the soil, which will have a benefit to that soil. Because when soils are richer in organic carbons, in general, they retain all the other cycles work better too. So sulfur, phosphorus, and potassium, all trace elements that plants need to grow, also get retained in those soils better. So I think the suberin will hopefully stay in the soil, depending on the soil type. It might last decades or hundreds of years or even thousands of years. And so we'll have to see how that works out, because that's data that we have to get. And we have to see how much more the suberin we can make in a plant will add to a given field, you know. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be the real proof of principle.
Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, I've read around that the suberin is the material of which cork and also cantaloupe rin is made. Yep. Is it right?
That's right.
Yeah. And what is the natural purpose of suberin? What is the function? I mean,
what suberin is it basically is like a sealant. And so when the plant thinks it's in a flood zone, for instance, it will make more suberin. It knows how to do that. But when it does that, it keeps the water from coming in. And if it's a drought, more suberin keeps the water that's inside from just being lost.
Okay.
And so it can seal off a plant from a pathogen.
So it's an actual envelope of the root.
It's a polymer laid down on certain cell types within the root.
Oh, okay.
And it lays it down on the outside of the cell, so it basically like forms a little ring of a seal in the cells that are going up the root and bringing in nutrients and stuff to the plant.
Okay. So I think there was one more question there. Yeah.
Hola, tengo una curiosidad. ¿Vosotros estáis investigando también en el campo electromagnético que produce cada planta? Porque algunos investigadores cerca de Bologna están midiendo el campo electromagnético de cada planta que interactúa con el medio ambiente, con los animales, con las personas, que son benéficos, y han valorado que cuando está en una tierra sana, el campo electromagnético es mucho más potente, mucho más efectivo. Cuando está en una tierra enferma, también este campo electromagnético que interacciona con todos es más débil. ¿Estáis investigando también en esto?
I don't speak Spanish.
You don't have the translation. Oh, sorry. Oh. Okay. So the question is whether, the question was about research. Apparently there is research in electromagnetic field of plants as a signal of the health or the quality of land and other things. So whether this research in electromagnetic field has some interaction with your research, some connection with your research.
So far, not. We don't have a connection, but I was at TED meeting with my husband. We heard plants like screaming when people walk by, so there is that. The plants do that, but whether or not it connects to something like an intelligent observation that the plant made, I don't think that's really known.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe you can tell him that.
Okay. One question there. We have time maybe for 2-3 questions more, so I think, not more than that. So, last chance.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm afraid that small changes in plants might affect the food chain of entire ecosystems. What's your opinion on this? Thank you very much.
Okay. I think our entire food system is based on really big changes in plants. And so I guess I'm not that worried necessarily. But you have to do all the right checks and balances. And so, if we make a small change and it's a crop people eat, then we have to make sure, we're not causing a change that's going to make a massive immune response or something like that, right? And so there's a lot of different tests that anything that gets used for food especially, they have to go through before they can be eaten by people. And so, I do think that breeders have brought in massively large changes to plants, which is how we all eat. Because, like tomato, it doesn't come as a big fruit. In the wild, tomatoes are tiny little fruit, right? And it's when you remove it from other genes that evolved with that gene that made the fruit small, that you can get these big fruit out. And so I think, breeding is something that, most people don't worry too much about. And so if it's like that, then I think you shouldn't be that worried. I wouldn't lose sleep over it anyway.
Okay, so one last round of questions, and then I think we are done. If there are no more questions, I would thank Joanne Chory and the organizers of the session, and good night.